If you've ever said, "I'll start once I'm more confident," you've fallen for one of productivity's biggest traps. Jung called it the shadow, the set of rejected traits, fears, and habits we push aside. He also argued that facing them is essential to real growth and maturity. Here's the part no one tells you: your doubts and flaws aren't just weaknesses to hide. When understood, they can open up new abilities you didn't know you had. Quick, what's one thing you hide at work to look sharper? Because often, the effort to hide looks of control takes more energy than the work itself. The mask of the productive self. Every day, we navigate a culture where performing productivity has become its own expectation. This is what I call the mask of the productive self. Everywhere you look, there's a stream of curated work routines, color-coded schedules, neatly arranged desks, and declarations about how many books someone finished this month. The message is clear. This is what productivity is supposed to look like. But much of it functions like a mask, worn not to make work easier, but to present control and polish even when life behind the screen feels frayed. Masks like this often go unnoticed because they blend into daily behavior. It might look like exaggerating how strict your focus routine is, or telling yourself you're endlessly efficient while quietly dreading your actual to-do list. The longer you wear it, the heavier it becomes. Each curated detail online adds to the pressure to live up to the story, and soon the act itself drains more energy than the work it's supposed to represent. Many professionals show up less to complete tasks than to guard the image of being the person who is always composed, always capable. Social media makes this even easier to maintain. Platforms encourage edited versions of our lives, and work is no exception. A feed filled with certificates, promotions, and productivity hacks looks convincing at a glance. But what's missing are the long evenings where energy is depleted, the hidden cycles of distraction, or the quiet burnout behind the scenes. Without those pieces, the mask ends up blurring the boundary between how life is lived and how it's presented. Recent workforce analytics point to something similar on a larger scale. The average workday is becoming compressed, yet focus efficiency is actually falling. And data from Gallup adds another revealing layer. Around 1 in 5 employees worldwide are actively engaged at work, while overall well-being has barely improved. If looking productive truly equaled being productive, those numbers would tell a different story. Instead, they suggest the mask often hides declining performance underneath a polished exterior. To see how this plays out in real life, imagine someone in their mid-20s balancing college classes, a part-time job, and a small side hustle to make ends meet. They post color-coded planners and updates about never wasting a minute, but privately they're stretched thin. The curated version draws admiration, while the reality is exhaustion and fragmented focus. The mask doesn't help them keep things together. It simply hides how fragile their balance has become. At its core, this dynamic is costly because energy goes into protecting the persona instead of fueling the task itself. Once you've shaped yourself into the person who always has it together, small lapses feel like exposure. Show up unprepared for a meeting, and it doesn't feel like a simple slip. It feels like your mask cracking. That pressure drives people to redirect even more effort into maintaining appearances. Over time, the strain shifts from completing real outcomes to sustaining credibility. The weight of the mask doesn't only exist publicly. It turns inward too. Many convince themselves they're fully in control by building hyper-structured systems, multiple apps, endless lists, color-coded trackers. These setups project clarity, but often they disguise the deeper avoidance of uncomfortable tasks. Instead of moving toward the few things that would shift work forward, energy gets caught in maintaining the illusion of mastery. This is the hidden cost of the mask. It doesn't just fool people around us, it fools the person wearing it. Think of it like carrying a heavy bag while trying to type. You can keep working, but every keystroke requires extra effort. Eventually, the weight becomes invisible, still present, still pressing down, but easier to overlook because you've adapted. The productivity mask works in much the same way. It demands constant vigilance, never showing tiredness, never admitting disorganization, and that strain quietly erodes genuine effectiveness. Survival mode begins to replace sustainable growth. A week behind the mask might not seem damaging, but months and years matter. Burnout rarely happens in a single moment. It accumulates through cycles of hiding and pretending. Every time attention is pulled into rehearsing the image of productivity, less remains for actual progress. People end up drained not by the work itself, but by the constant investment in defending appearances. The irony is that this posture, meant to enhance credibility, destabilizes it over time by stripping away the very results it set out to protect. Which leads us to the central problem. By clinging to the mask, people sabotage the potential they're trying to preserve. They step into each day tasked not only with meeting responsibilities, but with upholding the curated version of themselves. That added burden wastes attention and reduces resilience. When cracks finally show, the damage doesn't come from revealing flaws, it comes from the years of energy misdirected into hiding them. And this is where the deeper connection becomes clear. Productivity masks don't only distort how others see us, they also obscure how we see our own habits, the patterns where wasted effort passes for discipline. Those hidden patterns, the traits and behaviors we'd rather not face, form a more challenging layer beneath the surface. The shadow side of daily habits. Carl Jung described the shadow as the parts of ourselves we resist acknowledging, the flaws, fears, and motives we'd rather set aside. When it comes to daily productivity, the shadow doesn't just live in hidden aspects of personality. It shows up in the way we work, shaping common habits that appear useful but often serve as detours. This is the side of the shadow that operates not through obvious avoidance, but through routines that feel responsible while quietly stalling meaningful progress. Email is a clear illustration. Many people dedicate an hour each morning to sorting, flagging, and archiving messages. The desk feels organized, the inbox looks neat, and by the end, there's a sense of accomplishment. Yet if none of the day's most important work has moved forward, that hour wasn't true productivity, it was distraction repackaged as diligence. The shadow often takes disguises that look useful, which allows avoidance to persist unnoticed. Research is another common disguise. You set out to draft a report, but end up opening just one more article, then another, until several hours have passed. The stack of resources makes you feel prepared, careful, and thorough. But preparation without a decision to act is stalled progress. You've avoided risk. The report can't be criticized if it isn't written, yet convinced yourself you've been working. This is how the shadow sustains itself. It offers safe substitutes for forward movement while protecting your identity as someone thoughtful and productive. Perfectionism might be the most subtle form. Think of rewriting a single paragraph again and again, polishing every word until it feels flawless. On the surface, it looks like high standards. But in practice, it's often resistance to exposing your work to feedback. The shadow thrives here because polish provides cover. It's easier to stay in the comfort of draft improvements than to face the uncertainty of judgment. To challenge this in real time, try setting a micro rule. Today, take one paragraph, stop editing after the first pass, and send it. The discomfort of letting it go is exactly the signal that you've stepped past shadow avoidance and into real progress. Workplace data reflects how widespread this pattern has become. Recent analytics found focus efficiency hovering in the low 60s, while session lengths are actually increasing, more hours spent in apparent concentration, but less deep work accomplished. It's the statistical twin of the shadow habit: activity escalating, effectiveness slipping. People aren't doing nothing. They're doing more of what looks productive while losing ground on what matters. That is why days can feel full yet leave you unsatisfied. The shadow doesn't present as procrastination in the obvious sense. It suggests the satisfying click of mark all is read, the reassuring neatness of a reorganized calendar, the pride in spending hours researching instead of producing. These behaviors drain time while justifying themselves with logic. I need a clean inbox before I start the real work. I can't draft until I've gathered every detail. The reasoning sounds defensible, which is why spotting the shadow in daily choices requires careful honesty. The reinforcement often comes not just internally, but culturally. Workplaces still praise quick email responses, visible busyness, and the appearance of tireless involvement. Staying late can be celebrated even if the extra hours achieve little. Recognition of effort becomes a reward system for shadow habits. The results, slowed projects, unfocused progress, remain hidden behind the mask of constant activity. In this culture, you aren't just fighting personal avoidance. You're swimming against a current that mistakes visible effort for actual output. It helps to separate activity from effectiveness. Activity is always easy to show. The number of emails answered, the apps updated, the tabs researched. Effectiveness is harder to measure in real time because it's final, a submitted proposal, a finished draft, an experiment completed. The shadow avoids effectiveness because it can't hide there. A project is either shipped or not, a result either exists or it doesn't. So it steers energy toward endless cycles of visible activity, where effort looks convincing even when outcomes remain at a standstill. This matters because many shadow habits are built out of traits we'd normally admire. Thoroughness, organization, discipline, all can become tools for delay when they protect us from discomfort instead of pushing us through it. A person who claims to be meticulous might actually be resisting completion. A person who insists on careful preparation may be holding off on commitment. The habits themselves aren't inherently negative. It's their role as shields that quietly reshapes them into obstacles. To see the difference, look closely at common routines. Rising early is praised, managing inboxes seen as professional, color-coded planners as signs of control. But if those routines expand until the substantial work remains untouched, they've shifted into shadow territory. The question worth asking is simple. Did this habit actually push me closer to a meaningful goal, or did it mostly give me relief from facing the difficult step ahead? As you learn to notice this, something subtle changes. You catch yourself mid-action, opening yet another article under the banner of careful research. You sense the relief that comes from rearranging projects instead of confronting the hard one. Each of these is a signal, small, quiet, of the shadow in your daily systems. Recognition doesn't remove the habit overnight, but it takes away the illusion that it was progress. The shadow's influence in productivity is quiet but cumulative. A single hour spent in disguised busyness doesn't seem harmful. But spread across weeks, the hidden losses add up to entire projects deferred, opportunities left untouched, goals repeatedly shifted into the future. Its force doesn't come from drama, but from repetition. Each unchallenged cycle of avoidance becomes part of the foundation of your work habits. This is why the shadow side of habits matters, because it feeds on what we think of as preparation, discipline, or high standards, only to recycle that energy into safe detours. It doesn't block work loudly. It drains it steadily. And what makes it most difficult is that it hides from you even faster than it hides from others. At the end of a long day, exhaustion tells you the hours were full, yet results remind you they were. That gap is the shadow at work. And this gap creates the conditions for something else. Not just the habits themselves, but the way people imagine their potential outside them. Because if avoidance can disguise itself as progress, then it's easy to believe that your true productivity, your real capacity, lies just beyond the work you're actually doing. That tension between the fantasy of what you could achieve and the reality of how you usually work becomes the next challenge to confront. Fantasy versus reality in work performance. Many workers today carry a quiet assumption. They're convinced that under the right conditions, they could unleash a much higher level of performance. This belief feels reassuring because it keeps potential alive without requiring evidence. As long as you hold on to the idea that you could do better, you don't actually need to confront the numbers in front of you. You can live in a state where peak productivity feels just within reach, deferred until circumstances line up. The problem is that once reality presses in, deadlines, measurable outcomes, unfinished tasks, the comfort of that imagined version of yourself starts to fracture. This difference between imagined potential and delivered results becomes especially clear in how people use modern tools. Calendars fill themselves with recurring tasks, dashboards classify goals, and algorithm-driven assistants promise to optimize your time. At first glance, it looks nearly impossible to fail with so much support. But the data doesn't match the promise. Research continues to show that when workers collect more tools, attention splinters. People spend their hours refining timelines, reorganizing notes, and learning new software features instead of advancing on actual work. In practice, the very systems designed to increase effectiveness often become a way to maintain the fantasy. Imagine this scenario. You spend an entire morning setting up a new productivity app. Categories are built, colors locked in, labels carefully assigned. By lunchtime, the system sparkles with organization. It feels like progress, but the assignment you needed to finish remains untouched. No draft written, no client feedback addressed, just the glow of preparation. This tiny loop illustrates the larger split. One side creates the appearance of diligence, while the other side bears the reality that nothing meaningful has moved. Workplace research confirms this is more than a personal habit. Many organizations now rely on dozens of disconnected tools, a setup that increases friction instead of smoothing it. Planning multiplies while focus thins out. The illusion gets stronger through appearances. A neatly arranged chart looks like efficiency. A project dashboard with shifting progress bars looks like momentum. Yet those visuals often track activity rather than movement toward key results. You can complete subtasks all week, but if the main objective remains still, performance hasn't improved. This is why meetings can feel packed and updates impressive, yet deadlines slide by unacknowledged. The digital record points to order, while deliverables tell a different story. Continuing to operate in fantasy feels easier because it isn't measurable. You can always say you could stay focused for 12 hours or would finish a draft in one sitting without needing to prove it. As soon as you move from plans to action, limits surface. Tasks take longer than assumed, interruptions arrive, attention wanes. Action reveals where effort falls short. Fantasy remains untouchable because it never has to answer to a clock or outcome. That disconnect explains why many find comfort in organizing indefinitely rather than experiencing the test of actual work. Remote and hybrid work environments complicated this further. With less direct oversight, workers lean heavily on digital planning and project boards to display effort. Updates, polished timelines, and perfectly managed dashboards can substitute for tangible progress. Yet this doesn't always mean workers are less capable. Analytics have shown that remote-only employees, for example, often log an average of nearly half an hour more focused time each day. At the same time, they also face new interruptions that scatter attention across channels. This makes the gap between appearance and reality more situational. For some, the flexibility increases output, while for others it masks hours lost to constant digital check-ins. Numbers reveal how widespread the pattern has become. Studies in 2025 pointed out that a typical worker spends close to 8 hours a week interacting with organizational platforms, tweaking priorities, uploading updates, polishing categories. Of that time, only a slice translates into measurable action. The rest is swallowed by upkeep. When multiplied across an entire workforce, those hours amount to entire workdays that look busy without producing outcomes. Another metric driving this home is net effective hours, the time where activities produce results. Compared to official work hours, the gap keeps widening. Logged-in time doesn't match delivered work. The story of high potential persists, while the record of results falls away. If that sounds abstract, consider how it feels on a smaller scale. A worker believes they just need to fine-tune their system. One more folder structure, one more integration, one more perfected routine before output surges. Days pass and projects remain stuck at the same halfway mark. The worker reassures themselves that the next fix will unlock momentum. But the loop persists, tweak, delay, repeat. The sense of being capable gets preserved, but the work itself stands still. Why is this cycle so persistent? Because it protects identity. As long as you sit in preparation, you get to keep being the person who has everything under control. No data proves otherwise until you move into execution. And once you take that step, reality tests the self-image. Maybe you aren't as fast as you imagined. Maybe the work has rough edges. That clarity hurts, so it becomes less threatening to polish structures than to face imperfection. Fantasy feels more forgiving, while reality holds you accountable. The effects accumulate fast. Entire companies invest in systems to appear seamless, all while net productive hours lag. Entire teams log time updating boards, while priority milestones stall. Research confirms that AI adoption and heavier tool use often extend working hours instead of shortening them, because each new feature adds maintenance as well as complexity. Put simply, every new promise hides another cost. Where the fantasy is control, the reality is more scattered effort. Breaking the pattern requires concrete steps. First, notice when organizing becomes a substitute for progress. Catch yourself when you're configuring tools instead of completing tasks. Second, choose one simple metric to measure this week, not 10, not a whole dashboard. It might be one paragraph drafted, one client response sent, one key task marked complete. Third, practice executing with a timer, 20 or 30 minutes. The goal is to do the thing, not to plan the system around it. These steps sound small, but they anchor activity in reality rather than illusion. This is the real danger of living inside the fantasy of productivity. Hours pass, energy fades, but outcomes stand still. The structures that look polished can keep entire organizations convinced that progress exists, until missed deadlines and looming goals make it impossible to ignore. In the end, the fantasy drains more than time. It erodes focus by pulling attention into image management instead of honest execution. And that erosion has a hidden cost, one that reaches deeper than the hours lost on apps and charts. It starts feeding on the very parts of yourself you've been trying hardest to avoid. Cost of avoiding the shadow. Avoiding unflattering traits may seem protective, but in practice, it shifts focus and steadily drains mental energy. Concealing aspects of your behavior forces you to divide attention between actual work and maintaining appearances. That second layer of effort rarely draws direct notice, yet it weakens concentration over time. Even without visible failure, the ongoing defense of an image dulls precision and slows progress. Each time the shadow is ignored, clarity slips, because energy is redirected into disguise rather than into creating results. Perfectionism highlights this cost. On the surface, it poses as high standards, but often it reflects a deeper fear of letting imperfect work be seen. When you rewrite the same line for the fourth or fifth time, what you're avoiding is the discomfort of calling something finished. The hours consumed offer safety, not advancement. A useful test. If you edited a paragraph more than 3 times before sending, chances are you polished instead of progressed. Try the 3-pass rule this week. Draft, revise, review, then move on. That discomfort you feel at releasing it is the real step forward. Elaborate systems reveal the same pattern. A task manager loaded with dozens of categories and color codes offers the sense of precision, but the system itself produces little progress. It feels impressive to present dashboards with fine-grained labels, but when asked how many outcomes have actually been delivered, silence often follows. This is the shadow in visible form, avoidance packaged to look like diligence. These forms of avoidance are rarely challenged because, on the surface, they look like commitment. A colleague who spends hours polishing a presentation might be praised for their thoroughness, even as deadlines slip. The problem isn't that detail work has no value. It's that endless refinements can quietly replace actual delivery. In some organizational cultures, optics matter more than results, and in those environments the tendency to reward polish over output deepens the hidden costs. The shadow uses that misplaced recognition to persist, feeding on admiration while progress falls behind. The cost also arises in the countless micro-distractions that hidden flaws generate. When procrastination or fear is suppressed, the mind doesn't forget. It keeps running background checks to ensure the disguise holds. A person might not notice, but that unease interrupts focus throughout the day. Lingering doubts: was the report good enough? Did that task really get completed? Will someone notice the delay? Surface repeatedly. Each interruption steals a fragment of time, and accumulated over hours, those fragments become significant. Team environments amplify the effect. People appear to manage competing demands, but much of their energy shifts between maintaining appearances and doing real work. Someone caught in research as procrastination may sound confident in meetings, but later feel anxious about their actual workload. That anxiety leaks into communication, affects focus, and may even cost sleep. Productivity falters not because people lack skill, but because energy burns away in the effort to hide the struggle. As these habits spread, whole organizations carry the cost. One individual's disguised avoidance seems minor, but multiplied across dozens or hundreds of employees, the numbers expand quickly. A company may pay for 40 hours of scheduled work per person, only to find the meaningful output reflects far fewer. Arrivals and updates suggest dedication. End products tell a different story. Training and new apps are added as fixes, but unless the shadow is brought into view, the same cycle repeats: polish without completion. Gallup's State of the Global Workplace shows this dynamic clearly. Employee engagement remains low while reported well-being declines, reflecting that hidden stress drains energy at scale, even when surface commitment looks intact. The hardest part is that these patterns resist measurement. Standard performance metrics log meeting counts, task completions, or hours logged in systems, numbers that often reinforce the habits of avoidance. The shadow thrives because it adapts to what's measured. Workers polishing slides may appear enthusiastic. A long list of micro-tasks checked off each day looks busy. But behind these tallies, essential progress may remain stalled. Real evaluation must cut past appearances, asking whether effort advances outcomes or only maintains a mask. Viewed from the inside, protective language also reinforces the cycle. It feels safer to say you maintain very high standards than to admit that criticism worries you. It seems easier to point to elaborate systems when milestones slip than to admit that procrastination won out. Words act like shields, helpful for self-image in the short term, but costly when patterns compound over months. Concealed flaws behave like hidden debts, gathering interest until they exceed capacity. The psychological cost is as heavy as the practical one. Every day spent hiding flaws adds tension between outer identity and inner reality. That tension drains more than time. It consumes emotional reserves. The person who constantly maintains appearances also maintains a steady undercurrent of anxiety, fearing exposure. Stress spikes when deadlines press against perfectionist habits, and burnout develops not only from hours worked, but from the demand to keep the hidden shadow out of sight. The exhaustion isn't about overwork alone. It's about continual pretending. Ironically, what people struggle hardest to conceal often contains practical value. Perfectionism signals care for quality and can be productive when used consciously at the end of a process instead of as a stall. Procrastination reflects difficulty with starting, but can also mark stages of creative incubation if acknowledged. Even fear of release shows a desire for acceptance, which, once recognized, can sharpen how communication is designed. Refusing to look at these traits blocks the chance to work with them. What could become strength remains, stalled as avoidance. The underlying payoff is straightforward. Avoiding the shadow doesn't preserve productivity, it taxes it. Attention that might create results is instead spent covering weaknesses. Focus that might generate solutions is invested in maintaining appearances. Scaled across entire teams, these habits turn into significant collective losses, projects that run long, opportunities missed, profits reduced. What begins as minor personal habits, another draft, another recheck, another reorganization, expands into structural inefficiency. It's easy to laugh at the story of someone with 47 color-coded categories in their planner, but 0 tasks crossed out. The humor cuts because it feels familiar. Almost every workspace carries versions of the same cycle. A spreadsheet endlessly adjusted while no decisions are finalized, a polished document revised daily without release, an inbox kept at 0, but client calls left undone. What looks professional on the outside signals avoidance within. And here lies the deeper cost. The strongest drag on productivity doesn't always come from workload or external pressure. It comes from the invisible habits individuals refuse to face. They reinforce high standards as armor, stack systems as cover, and polish surfaces until the difference between appearance and movement disappears. Without pulling these shadows into clear view, the drain continues, widening the gap between what looks like progress and what actually moves forward. Recognizing that gap is not simple. It demands a kind of honesty that goes beyond checking lists or showing dashboards. It means asking whether the energy spent protecting your image could have built something measurable. The next challenge is whether you're willing to test that directly, whether you would rather stay inside the comfort of potential or confront what the numbers reveal about your real output. Facing measurement without fear. When appearances no longer hold, the question becomes simple. What happens when you place yourself against actual evidence? This is the task of facing measurement without fear. Honest numbers reveal what stories usually conceal. They set boundaries, and those boundaries can sting. But unlike fantasy, they give you a clear starting point. For most people, the problem isn't lack of desire to improve, it's the anxiety of seeing themselves quantified. Measurement strips away ambiguity. If you write 5 pages a week, the figure cannot be spun into brilliance. If your average turnaround time doubles that of your peers, the comparison speaks plainly. Numbers expose, and with exposure comes a threat to identity, which is why many avoid them. Not because they don't care about results, but because knowing feels riskier than imagining. Potential offers safety. As long as you don't measure, you can tell yourself you could be excellent. You can believe your best work is waiting for the right day, conditions, or inspiration. Fantasy lets you hold unlimited possibility. Reality imposes limits. Reality might say you're improving at only 1% a month. And when identity is tied to the idea of hidden brilliance, those limits feel harsh. Yet what limits also do is provide a foundation for growth. The resistance to measurement often shows up in feedback. Verbal encouragement can be stretched or interpreted, but data is harder to challenge. A chart that displays low completion rates or high error counts is not softened by interpretation. Facing it brings discomfort, but it also opens a path forward. Without those figures, improvement becomes guesswork, and guesswork rarely raises performance. Ego protection becomes the priority when measurement is avoided. Someone might spend weeks planning a project, mapping systems, and fine-tuning tasks, but never track their actual completion. The project feels alive in preparation, but never materializes in evidence. That hidden fear ensures progress is sacrificed to maintain self-image. The irony is clear. You preserve pride but abandon learning. Measurement is costly in another sense too. It disrupts the stories people cling to. If you've built your self-image around long hours, time tracking may reveal that peers who work fewer but sharper sessions accomplish more. If you pride yourself on speed, quality control checks may show double the errors. Such revelations break comforting illusions. They're not just numbers, they dismantle personal identities. That breakdown is why people resist, even when numbers could be their guide. Yet those who choose to measure usually end up stronger. The sting of exposure doesn't last as long as the clarity it provides. A runner who learns they run a 12-minute mile may be discouraged at first, but now progress is quantifiable. A student who tracks actual focused hours of study may discover the gap between intention and execution, but can also watch that gap shrink week by week. Measured truth hurts less over time because it creates a direction forward. Consider two colleagues balancing coursework and a side hustle. One refuses to tally actual work hours, choosing instead to trust their effort feels sufficient. They fall into cycles of doubt, never sure if they're doing enough. The other logs their weekly hours and deliverables. Early numbers are disappointing, but over months the record shows improvement, study time grows, projects complete more reliably, distractions retreat. The first chooses comfort but stays uncertain. The second accepts discomfort, yet gains proof they're progressing. Only one builds steady confidence rooted in evidence. Recent workforce analytics reinforce this lesson. Studies show measured productive time often looks very different from logged hours. In fact, one report found total hours in the workday shortened slightly, but average productive time actually rose by about 2%. The implication is clear. What matters isn't the appearance of effort, but the concrete measurement of outcomes. Without tracking, those shifts remain invisible, leaving the illusion of decline when real output is actually improving. At its best, measurement moves you from guesswork to clarity. The tool is simple but easy to misuse. If it becomes punishment, it can cause paralysis or frustration, leading some to abandon the attempt entirely. Measurement works only if framed as a baseline for growth, not a verdict on personal worth. Numbers are not the whole story. They are starting points, reference marks that help you adjust course. A disappointing tally is not failure. It is evidence of where progress begins. The question is how to start tracking without fear or overcomplication. 3 simple prompts can establish a path. Track one meaningful output each day rather than activity, run a 25-minute sprint, and record whether the key task was finished, and note just one distraction along with its trigger. These small habits turn abstract effort into concrete data. They replace assumptions with visible evidence, showing what patterns either block or build momentum. The choice comes down to which pain you are willing to accept, the sharp but brief discomfort of knowing where you stand, or the slow erosion of never testing what you claim. Avoiding measurement keeps pride intact today, but guarantees stagnation tomorrow. Facing measurement shakes identity now, but creates direction you can improve. That direction compounds, bringing confidence that can't be fabricated by potential alone. The fear never disappears completely. Each metric review carries the risk of embarrassment, yet repetition softens the sting. With time, numbers become less about judgment and more about insight. You remain the same person before and after, but with a clearer view of where your energy lands. With that clarity, setbacks turn into baselines, and progress becomes tangible. What stands out is how often people underestimate the relief of data. Ambiguity is stressful. Stories about yourself are costly to maintain. But once reality is measured, the unknown shrinks. It may confirm weakness, but weakness visible is already weakness being reshaped. Growth begins not when you protect identity, but when you test it. And this is where fear changes shape. It is no longer simply about what the numbers will reveal, but also about what they might uncover in you. Because once the flaws come into the open, you may start to notice they are not just barriers, but signals, sometimes even strengths in disguise. Shadow is superpower. One of the most practical shifts comes when you begin to see the shadow not only as a barrier, but as a source of untapped resource. This is where the idea of the shadow as superpower takes shape. In Jung's model of individuation, growth comes from weaving the conscious and unconscious into a more complete self. Applied to daily work, this means that traits we classify as flaws often contain raw strengths when handled deliberately. Integration does not erase the shadow, but it often reveals its hidden capacities. Self-awareness research supports this too. Studies show that people who understand their patterns and blind spots perform more effectively in organizations, partly because they can adjust rather than deny. Think about procrastination. On the surface, it looks like unproductive avoidance. Deadlines slip, pressure mounts, and guilt grows. Yet behind procrastination sits something more nuanced. The brain often incubates ideas while appearing idle. Many people find that when they finally begin, connections and insights emerge quickly. The trick is not to glorify delay, but to convert it into a conscious process. A simple practice is to allow a fixed incubation window, say half a day for thinking and note-taking, followed by a 25-minute timer sprint to break the freeze. This pattern turns avoidance into structured preparation, without surrendering to endless postponement. The shadow here becomes a rhythm that, once managed, supports sharper starts. Perfectionism tells a similar story. Left unchecked, it slows projects to a crawl. Hours vanish into repeated edits, small adjustments, and reluctance to release anything less than flawless. But beneath this tendency lies high sensitivity to quality. That discernment only becomes destructive when it spreads across every stage. Redirected toward the review phase, it can refine work instead of stalling it. A micro-practice for this is the timed review. Set aside a strict 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the process to polish, but forbid perfectionist edits until that moment arrives. This way, you still apply your critical eye, but at the point where it enhances output rather than blocks it. In this way, the shadow of perfectionism isn't erased. It is trained into a sharper tool. Now consider stubbornness. At its worst, it alienates teammates, sparks conflict, and drags decision-making into deadlock. But stubbornness is really persistence without a channel. When you give it direction, it becomes resilience, the ability to continue even when obstacles multiply. The practice here is simple. Before locking horns with others, define where persistence should belong. Align your non-negotiable with a long-term objective, not a short-term disagreement. This keeps the energy of stubbornness steady, but purposeful. Over time, the trait that once fueled friction becomes the same trait that drives projects through long stretches when motivation dips. Discipline reshapes defensiveness into durability. The key in all these cases is honesty first. If you deny that procrastination causes missed deadlines or that stubbornness causes conflict, you can't redirect them. You must acknowledge the cost before attempting to recover the benefit. Integration isn't an excuse to romanticize flaws, it's a process of reshaping them with responsibility. Without that step of sober admission, the so-called superpower never comes forward at all. Culture often makes this reframing difficult. Schools, workplaces, and social feeds push toward suppressing or masking the shadow. Students are told not to procrastinate, workers are told not to be stubborn, employees are told to avoid perfectionism. The emphasis is on erasing weakness, not refining it. But when hidden, those traits never mature. A procrastinator criticized only as lazy never learns how to time their incubation for maximum payoff. A stubborn child shamed into submission may never discover how persistence could anchor long-term goals. By forcing conformity, environments often bury potential instead of shaping it. Reintegration requires a different language. Rather than saying, "This is a flaw I must eliminate," you can approach it as, "This is raw energy I must direct." Raw energy is messy, but once channeled, it becomes durable. Procrastination forms a rhythm, perfectionism sharpens vision, stubbornness builds grit. These are not automatic transformations. They are deliberate adjustments that convert instability into function. Of course, some traits run deeper, straining relationships, or leading to regular personal crises. It's worth underscoring that if these patterns seriously disrupt work or personal life, professional help is the right step. This framework is not a substitute for therapy, but a way to recognize the everyday shadows that drain productivity if ignored. With guidance, what begins as liability can still evolve into capacity. The larger value is in the shift of perspective. Embracing the shadow as potential does not mean glossing over struggle. It means choosing to study your resistances instead of running from them. It means asking, where is the usable energy inside this behavior? How can I create a small rule that directs it rather than erases it? Each concrete practice pares down the risk of self-sabotage while allowing the strength to surface. And gradually, you begin to notice something. Patterns you once resented show up as part of your unique contribution when rightly placed. This reframing changes how you face self-doubt as well. Fear of being exposed often keeps people from testing their limits, but by integrating flaws into your process, self-doubt shifts into awareness. Instead of saying, "I procrastinate, therefore I'm unreliable," you begin to say, "I tend to delay, therefore I'll use that time wisely," and set an external trigger to start. The shadow doesn't disappear. It takes its seat at the table with defined work. Looking across these examples, it becomes difficult to ignore how much potential remains trapped when people pretend their flaws don't exist. Each unwanted trait is also a reservoir of possibility, but the reservoir is accessed only by conscious redirection. Evidence supports this. Workplace studies confirm that individuals with higher self-awareness consistently outperform less self-aware colleagues, not because they lack flaws, but because they recognize, track, and repurpose them. The practice of noticing and reframing traits translates not only to personal improvement, but to measurable efficiency and effectiveness. The shadow as superpower, then, is not a guarantee but an opportunity. It asks whether you are willing to confront what weakens you long enough to uncover what supports you. It insists that every recurring frustration may also outline the shape of your strengths. This is not theory alone, it is a usable practice. By choosing micro steps like timed reviews, incubation sprints, and directed persistence, you convert traits into tools. And this is where a deeper challenge emerges. Recognition is only the first step. The real question is what to do next. Seeing the shadow as an untapped resource opens the door, but it doesn't tell you how to walk through it. To make the shift practical, you need methods, concrete exercises that expose traits, test small adjustments, and ground awareness in daily routines. That's where the next step begins. Exercises for shadow integration. Once you begin to notice the shadow in yourself, the next move isn't to analyze endlessly, but to put it into practice. Awareness without action fades quickly. What gives it weight are concrete exercises that make the shadow visible in real time and create deliberate moments of choice. The purpose of these techniques isn't to punish weakness, but to test small steps that let you see your patterns and steer them instead of being ruled by them. The first exercise is naming. When you give a recurring pattern a label, you create distance between yourself and the behavior. If you just say, "I procrastinate," it remains vague. But if you call the voice that delays you the avoider, or the tendency to rewrite endlessly the polisher, the habit becomes something separate that you can recognize when it shows up. A micro practice here is simple. Take your phone, open a note, and type one label for the shadow trait you notice most often. The next time it appears, say to yourself, "Here is the avoider," instead of saying, "I am procrastinating." That subtle shift interrupts identification and opens a gap for decision. For best effect in the video, add a short 60-second guided script for viewers. Walk them through the act of writing the label, noticing the shadow, and practicing how to call it by name when it appears. This immediate trial keeps the concept alive while the audience is still watching. The second exercise is exposure. Hidden patterns thrive in secrecy. They dissolve when brought into the open. The task here is to let the shadow appear consciously, but within a clear boundary. If you often delay emails, set a timer for 5 minutes and watch yourself rewrite them. Do not intervene or judge, just observe. This controlled exposure makes it easier to see what excuses or fears drive the delay. Another variation is with phone use. Rather than scrolling unconsciously, give yourself 10 minutes of deliberate scrolling. Notice when the shift happens from relaxation to compulsion. A micro-practice prompt. Choose one behavior you usually hide, then set a timer for a short window, 5 to 10 minutes, and watch yourself do it openly. Write down one sentence about what you observed. By shining a light, you weaken the habit's hidden pull. The third exercise is tracking. Most people believe their shadow interferes only occasionally, but measured records tell a different story. Pick one behavior, say perfectionism, and keep a simple daily tally. Each time it surfaces, make a quick note, rewrote line 5 times, or spent 12 minutes adjusting slide colors. At the end of the week, review the list. Suddenly, the volume becomes clear. A micro-practice is to carry a sticky note or phone memo each day and log only the first 3 instances you catch. At week's end, circle the most frequent trigger. The act of recording breaks denial, and over time you'll also see patterns. Perfectionism might spike at the beginning of a project, or distraction may cluster in late afternoons. Anticipating those rhythms lets you plan better. If tracking shows that focus dips after lunch, for example, you can schedule low-stakes tasks for that period and protect deep work for the morning. The fourth exercise is reversal. Instead of subtly fighting the trait, exaggerate it until its absurdity becomes undeniable. If you obsess over presentation formatting, dedicate a half hour to changing fonts and sizes without touching substance. Almost immediately, the silliness of the exercise makes the compulsion easier to see. Humor is what weakens the shadow's heaviness here. A micro-practice. Pick one trait that bothers you, then set a timer for 15 minutes to overplay it deliberately. Laugh at the behavior while doing it. On the other side of that timer, pause and ask yourself, do I want to keep doing this, or do I want to shift? Reversal drains intensity and makes choice reappear. Together, these 4 methods, naming, exposure, tracking, and reversal, create structured awareness. They don't eliminate the shadow, but they reduce its control by exposing its mechanics. This distance is what matters. Without it, the behavior runs on autopilot. With it, you decide how to respond. What looks small in practice scales into greater freedom over time. Research backs this idea up. Studies on self-awareness training from organizations like the Learning Guild and a Head app show that when people learn to observe their patterns clearly, both performance and team dynamics improve. Leaders with higher self-awareness tend to communicate better, recover faster from mistakes, and create stronger collaboration. These exercises may look simple, but they build the same muscle, turning unconscious habits into visible, workable material. That's why even a single week of tracking or naming can change not only how you work alone, but also how you relate inside a team. It's worth noting that for most people, these practices will uncover manageable habits like procrastination or perfectionism. But if repeated exposure to your shadow sparks overwhelming emotions or brings up difficult past memories, stop and seek guidance from a coach or therapist. Integration isn't always comfortable, and sometimes professional support is the right safety measure. The point is growth, not harm. The payoff of regular practice is that doubt, distraction, and self-criticism stop feeling like proof of failure. They become signals you know how to interpret. Over time, you no longer treat procrastination as laziness. You see it as a moment of avoidance that now calls for a timer sprint. Doom scrolling stops pretending to be rest because your log shows the switch into compulsion. Perfectionism stops hiding as standards because you can laugh at its exaggeration and redirect it to the final review stage. What once hijacked your performance in secret now speaks openly, and you choose the reply. These exercises do not eradicate the shadow, they reveal it. They transform what was hidden into something you can measure, guide, and even harness. The difference is clear. You are no longer drained by maintaining appearances, but energized by making deliberate choices. It's the same energy that once kept your flaws buried, now redirected to support your outcomes. Step by step, structured awareness overtakes the exhaustion of hiding. And this shift reaches beyond personal focus. The ability to confront the shadow, label it, and work with it also sharpens how you operate in shared environments. Those who practice self-honesty spend less time defending or disguising weaknesses, which leaves more space for progress. In many settings, that edge, not raw speed, not sheer intelligence, marks the real difference in long-term development. The competitive advantage of self-honesty. In professional environments, the ability to see yourself clearly creates a practical advantage that often outweighs raw ability. This is the essence of self-honesty. It isn't about self-deprecation, and it isn't about lowering standards. It's the capacity to acknowledge both strengths and limits without disguise. In Jungian terms, it means accepting the shadow and integrating it into daily work rather than wasting energy hiding it. When you work from this basis, you remove the constant drain tied to image management and free resources for actual performance. Most employees avoid this posture because they equate honesty with weakness. Admitting to procrastination feels like confessing incompetence. Saying you overpolish a task comes across as lowering your credibility. So instead of candor, people build defenses. They project confidence, talk about their potential, and shield themselves from measurement. Yet this protection breeds fragility. So much energy is invested in curating the mask of competence that there is little left for improvement. In this way, avoidance may protect the ego in the short term, but it hinders growth in the long term. The shadow flourishes whenever truth is denied. Someone afraid of failure refuses to act without perfect preparation, convincing themselves they are just being responsible. Another claims to be an excellent multitasker, but their divided attention slows every project they touch. These choices defend identity, but create silent erosion underneath. The cost itself is measurable. Gallup's State of the Global Workplace reports that only about 21% of employees are engaged at work. That low engagement, compounded across countries, translates into massive lost productivity and economic cost. Much of this disengagement stems not from lack of intelligence or hours, but from the tension of constantly sustaining appearances rather than integrating the reality of one's own flaws. Contrast that against a worker willing to measure and admit honestly. They acknowledge where their focus slips. They tally instances of delay. They stop pretending that distraction doesn't drain their output. At first this stings, ego resists. But once the denial drops, energy is no longer wasted on defense. That energy gets redirected into choosing supports, creating small adjustments, and making progress transparent. Integration removes the burden of secrecy. It transforms the same flaw from a liability into material that can be managed. This is why self-honesty becomes a competitive advantage. Very few are willing to embrace this discomfort. So while most professionals linger in cycles of avoidance, those who practice honest self-assessment build a kind of clarity that colleagues lack. They know their blind spots and correct them systematically. They use accurate language around their weaknesses and therefore receive feedback that is sharper and more useful. Over months and years, these small adjustments compound. Advancement, influence, and trust naturally concentrate around the people who consistently show reality rather than manufacture image. A simple vignette shows the effect. Imagine a manager faced with recurring delays. Instead of excusing inefficiency through external factors, they openly admit, "I get stuck in overplanning." They then commit to a limit, sketching a project structure in one day, beginning execution on the second. Progress is tracked, and the pattern slowly shifts. Colleagues notice the change not only in delivery time, but also in the credibility that honesty generates. By refusing to protect ego, that manager signals reliability and sets a pace others want to follow. From the organizational view, the payoff becomes clear. Self-honest employees reduce unexpected friction. They signal early when something stalls and can be trusted to report accurately on their limits. Managers respond because two things happen at once. Less coordination overhead is needed, and output improves in measurable ways. It can be said simply, honest self-assessment reduces blind spots and builds trust with managers. And when teams have transparent members, they require less coordination overhead and produce more consistent results. Data from companies like ActiveTrack and Epsura reinforces this. Smarter work practices and integrated systems rely less on performance theater and more on actual evidence. Leaders themselves are not exempt from this principle. Research paraphrased by sources like Ivy Exec and Epshira notes that leaders who integrate inner work show steadier decision-making and greater resilience under pressure. While honesty about flaws might feel personally risky, at the executive level it stabilizes judgment by reducing the hidden tension between appearance and reality. This is not mystical, it's practical. A leader who recognizes impatience can plan for it, just as an employee who admits distraction can build supports around it. Self-honesty is scalable. It steadies performance all the way from entry-level roles to senior decision-making. Workers avoiding self-honesty often labor under another paradox. They think denial preserves self-esteem, but it actually heightens anxiety. When your identity rests on an untested image, every critique threatens collapse. Each question from a manager feels like exposure. By contrast, admitting flaws strips that power. When you've already acknowledged a habit of over-editing or avoiding starts, feedback no longer strikes at identity. It simply confirms patterns already visible to you. This shift lowers stress. Instead of identity trembling under pressure, confidence grows sturdier because the foundation is real. Creativity benefits in the same way. Employees invested in protecting their facade avoid risk, fearing that failed experiments might crack their image. Those who work with their shadow accept visible failure as part of honest process. They already recognize they are capable of imperfection, so another failed trial does not feel catastrophic. This perspective creates more space for innovation. A willingness to acknowledge weakness frees you to attempt unconventional solutions. Here, the advantage isn't perfection, it's resilience in the face of imperfection. The organizational climate magnifies these differences. Teams composed of members who constantly defend their image burn countless hours maintaining polish rather than tackling essentials. Meetings swell with explanations and performance rituals. Meanwhile, a team with even one or two self-honest members cuts through the noise. Trust builds faster, goals are clearer, and conflicts resolve with less defensiveness. Transparency, even in small amounts, stabilizes collaboration because people don't need to decode hidden agendas. Trust and competence converge in those who are willing to speak plainly about their limits. Over time, this forms reputations that carry weight. Colleagues come to rely on the honesty of certain individuals, not because they are flawless, but because they are consistent. Reliability built on clear-eyed self-assessment scales across departments. Influence grows because transparency creates efficiency. Others no longer waste time compensating for hidden flaws. This is the real competitive advantage, not erasing flaws, but refusing to burn resources hiding them. So the lesson is practical, even blunt. Each minute used to polish an image or hide a weakness is a minute lost to improvement. Every defensive explanation is time diverted from progress. Workers who refuse these detours reclaim their focus. They channel limitations into adjustments instead of excuses. Step by step, this orientation compounds. Self-honest individuals advance not faster because they are better, but because their energy flows toward work instead of defense. And this orientation introduces a deeper possibility. Recognizing the competitive edge of self-honesty raises a new question. How can individuals systematically remove the energy drain caused by blind spots? The next step isn't adding new systems or chasing more hacks. It lies in creating a structure that pinpoints suppressed traits, tests small integrations, and turns liabilities into usable resources. This is where the shift from theory to method begins. Framework to transform blind spots. Most people assume that the path to improvement comes from adding new tools, new routines, another app, another system to finally fix distractions. But real progress often comes from removing what quietly drains momentum each day. Rather than layering more on top, the key is subtraction, exposing the blind spots that pull energy away without you realizing. That's the basis of this framework for transforming blind spots into advantages. It's not about replacing who you are or forcing yourself into more hustle. It's about giving structure to the traits you normally hide, so their energy works for you instead of against you. Research on workplace tech backs this up. Studies show organizations often juggle dozens of disconnected tools, fracturing attention. More layers do not mean more results. The same is true for individuals. Piling on hacks rarely solves the root issue. What makes a difference is subtracting distractions at their source. This framework offers a way to do that Simple, repeatable steps that require subtraction before addition. The 4 steps are identify, map, reframe, and redirect. You can think of it as a checklist to run anytime a hidden trait gets in your way. Step 1 is identify. The task here is clear. Name one shadow trait without judgment. It could be procrastination, perfectionism, impatience, avoidance. Anything you sense is repeating itself in your work. Don't describe the feeling, don't speculate on causes, just write a single line. I stall on important tasks until they become urgent. I rewrite past the point of usefulness. A single, direct sentence makes vague guilt into visible evidence. To put this into practice right now, open a note on your phone or a sheet of paper and type one trait. Or, if you want accountability, share it in the comments. It can be private if you prefer, but naming it immediately strips away denial. Step 2 is map. Identifying the trait shows you what exists, but mapping shows you exactly where it drains you. Ask yourself, when does this trait appear? If procrastination is the issue, note the points in your process where delay always occurs. Maybe you hesitate right at the beginning, or maybe you freeze near the end. Break it into concrete examples. I avoid starting outlines, or I get stuck on writing the final section. A micro task here is simple. Pick one context from your week and write 3 short bullet points of where the trait surfaced. The point isn't to blame yourself, but to capture the specifics. Once mapped, the blind spot loses vagueness and becomes something you can see operating in real time. Step 3 is reframe. This is where you experiment with flipping the meaning of the trait so its energy isn't wasted. Reframing doesn't erase the flaw, it takes its motion and turns it. For procrastination, instead of unconsciously avoiding, turn it into structured incubation. I'll take a half day to brainstorm before committing to action. For stubbornness, flip it from tension in arguments to endurance while pursuing outcomes. This same drive can fuel persistence if I direct it to finishing what matters. A micro-practice is to write one sentence capturing your reframed meaning. For example, my delay is not laziness, it's incubation, limited to 12 hours before I begin. By consciously reshaping the story, you redirect the pull without fighting it. Step 4 is redirect. A reframed trait only gains value when aimed at something measurable. Without this step, reframe remains a concept. You must give it a target. Suppose impatience is your shadow. After reframing it as urgency, decide on a metric. Reduce waiting by proposing 2 concrete action steps in every meeting, or track how many blocked hours you save by cutting decisions early. A one-sentence redirection could be, this week I'll channel impatience into closing 2 loose tasks before the day ends. Clear evidence is what turns a reframe into a resource. Together, these 4 steps form a cycle you can repeat with any trait. Identify, map, reframe, redirect. Quick checklist style. Identify, write one line naming the trait. Map, note 3 contexts where it appears. Reframe, draft 1 short alternative phrasing. Redirect, set 1 measurable goal tied to it this week. That's the framework in practice. Not abstract, not philosophical, tangible micro-actions you can return to whenever a blind spot surfaces. An example makes the process concrete. Picture 2 professionals who both struggle with perfectionism. The first suppresses it, insisting they just care about quality. They spend late nights editing slides, delay deadlines, and hide the stress it causes. Their team grows frustrated because polish replaces delivery. The second professional works with the framework. They identify perfectionism by writing, I resist submitting drafts. They map it by noting, this happens before presentations and again with written reports. They reframe it, my precision is useful if it's saved for a final review slot. And they redirect it, set a goal to spend 15 minutes polishing only at the end. In practice, deadlines are hit, quality remains, and the person feels lighter because the flaw now has a channel. The difference isn't talent, it's structured honesty about the shadow. Because these traits are deeply personal, reframing and redirecting them creates a unique edge that others can't copy. Anyone can imitate your schedules or tools, but no one can imitate the way you transform your exact blind spots. That's what makes this framework powerful. It shapes weaknesses into competitive advantages that are impossible to duplicate. For viewers, the entry point is small. If you want to practice in real time, choose one trait right now and write it down in a comment or note it privately in your phone. No elaboration needed, just one line. I delay until the last minute. I micromanage details. I stall on decisions. The act of naming gives you a foothold to work with the framework later. This approach is deliberately stripped down because subtraction builds sustainability. Where hustle culture pushes additions, more apps, longer hours, tighter routines, this framework pulls you back to the quiet patterns that sap energy. By subtracting their control, you recover more focus than a new system could give. Data from employee analytics points the same way. Piling on new tools tends to fragment attention, while measured subtraction often improves the actual work experience. Removing hidden drains is more fertile than adding another hack on top. The payoff of using this framework isn't instant mastery, but steady progress. Each repeated cycle deepens awareness. Each time you identify and map, you weaken the hold of denial. Each reframing sharpens your ability to channel raw energy. Each redirection adds visible results to your work output. Small cycles compound. What begins as a single sentence in a note app grows into a structural change in how you operate day after day. The most important thing is not chasing perfection with the framework. It's testing it in small, daily contexts. One trait, one mapped example, one reframed sentence, one redirection goal. These micro steps are not placeholders for bigger change. They are the mechanism of bigger change. Integration doesn't happen in sweeping transformations. It happens in repeated short steps you stay with long enough for patterns to shift. At some point, the process itself becomes lighter. Once you realize your shadow traits don't need to stay hidden, they stop feeling like shame and start feeling like material you can use. Managing them turns into a kind of craft. And when the tension of hiding eases, you free time, energy, and even perspective that would otherwise be wasted. There is also a psychological reward. Honest self-assessment once felt like a threat to identity. With practice, it becomes part of normal rhythm. Flaws lose their heaviness. Blind spots take on form. The reframe often makes you laugh lightly when you catch yourself repeating an old impulse. Instead of guilt, you smile and apply the framework again. That small change in tone signals something important, that the shadow isn't ruling unconsciously anymore. And that shift in tone reveals the next layer. Because once the seriousness softens, you begin to realize that the shadow doesn't always need to be met with pressure or severity. Sometimes, recognizing it with a little levity is the clearest sign of real integration. Humor in the shadows. Where the framework creates structure, the next tool brings lightness. Humor in the shadows. Flaws so often carry heaviness because they remain unspoken or protected by shame. Yet one of the simplest ways to loosen their grip is to laugh at them. When you strip away secrecy, the actions you once treated as serious faults can look more like over-the-top performances than devastating flaws. Humor reframes them as small missteps, the kinds of things every human trips over. And when seen that way, their power fades. Take perfectionism. On the surface, it looks like a dedication to quality, but zoom in and the scenes become surprisingly comic. Picture someone up at midnight, hunched over their screen, not rewriting arguments but nudging a bullet point 2 pixels to the left. Or spending an entire evening swapping fonts between Times New Roman and Calibri as though the future of the project depends on it. There's nothing noble here, it's closer to slapstick. The moment you name it that way, the illusion of dignity vanishes. You can even say aloud, "Yes, I lost hours fighting fonts last night," and watch colleagues laugh in recognition. That laugh releases the tension. Instead of needing to defend perfectionism as high standards, you turn it into a joke that everyone, including you, can see through. Distractions carry the same absurdity. Maybe you open your laptop determined to research key statistics and find yourself 20 minutes later deep in a video of someone building birdhouses. In your head, the narrative still says, "I'm prepping for the presentation," but the evidence is comical. I can admit it myself. I once convinced myself that scrolling through memes was field research on communication styles. That's the shadow trying to protect itself with seriousness. But phrased honestly, it becomes laughable, and the laughter breaks the spell. 2 ultra-short examples land especially well with audiences. I told myself 3 hours on Wikipedia was thorough preparation, and somehow my project on marketing data turned into expert-level knowledge of alpaca farming. Both are funny precisely because they sound familiar. The same holds true for procrastination. Described heavily, it feels like shame, but captured with honesty, it looks like theater. The desk is cleared, pens are stacked by color, papers aligned, playlists organized, snacks arranged, everything perfect except the actual task. Watching this is like watching a one-person stage play. You almost expect an audience to applaud the performance of productive avoidance. A little humor here turns what was a source of guilt into something visible and manageable. When a deadline looms, I suddenly become a world-class stationery curator. That single line flips the weight of shame into a lighter recognition. Bringing humor into shadows matters because secrecy and silence are what fuel them. Shame thrives when behavior remains hidden. Laughter interrupts that cycle. Imagine in a meeting admitting, I told myself I was researching, but really I fell into 30 minutes of cooking videos. People laugh because everyone knows the trick. And in that moment, your flaw no longer isolates you. It integrates you into the group through shared recognition. What once felt like weakness becomes a bridge of connection. There's also resilience in joking about flaws. Mistakes handled with secrecy often spiral into overreaction. One slip wrecks composure because the mask breaks. But if you can laugh at your errors, they lose that destructive weight. Miss a deadline and joke? Apparently my shadow runs the clock faster than I do, and the tone shifts instantly. Self-deprecating humor signals that imperfection doesn't dent your worth. You gain something rarer than sheer discipline. You gain flexibility. Another value of humor is perspective. Take flaws seriously and they loom large. Laugh at them and they shrink. Perfectionism stops being proof you'll miss every deadline and starts being that quirk where you resize bullet points endlessly. Procrastination stops being evidence of laziness and becomes the yearly ritual of reorganizing the closet right before an exam. What was once a threat is reframed as a manageable quirk. And if you can laugh at a quirk, you're already halfway to controlling it. Work environments benefit too. Many professional spaces reward the illusion of constant order and discipline, which can suffocate honesty. Humor provides the release valve. A leader who jokes, lost an afternoon aligning table cells again, lowers the pressure for others to pretend strict control. Colleagues feel safe to admit their own quirks and laugh about them. One small public crack of humor diffuses the heavy culture of productivity theater. Humor doesn't just soften the mood, it strengthens teams. Call-outs of wasted effort usually trigger defensiveness, but phrased jokingly, they land without hostility. Saying, I see your file structure has 4 new folders, so the report must be nearly finished, gets a smile, a nod, and an unspoken recognition that busy work has eaten the real task. No accusation needed. The flaw is acknowledged, lightened, and left workable. Humor makes space for correction, where blunt criticism might close it down. Still, humor is not a license to dismiss real problems. It's a tool, not a cure. Laughing at flaws builds resilience, shows perspective, and reduces shame, but some patterns cause repeated harm if ignored. If joking about procrastination hides the fact that deadlines are consistently missed, or humor shields conflicts where stubbornness damages relationships, laughter alone won't resolve it. In those cases, professional support, a coach, mentor, or therapist, becomes the step that matters. Think of humor as resilience in action, not as an excuse to avoid responsibility. Laugh, but notice when humor hides a pattern that needs help. For the majority of ordinary patterns, like font battles, desk rearrangements, or meme spirals, humor is more than enough to shrink the shadow's presence. And when you can hold your own patterns up for laughter, you also model for others how to drop pretenses. That's why it's valuable for the host, or anyone sharing these ideas, to offer a quick self-deprecating example. A single line about how you once wasted an hour resizing margins or polishing PowerPoint animations signals that you're not above the same flaws. It breaks down distance and shows firsthand that humor brings connection as well as clarity. If no personal story is available, even scripted examples like, I've lost entire evenings color-coding my calendar and never following it, work effectively. The payoff here is simple. Humor changes the relationship you have with your flaws. Once you can laugh at your shadow, it no longer hides in silence. It doesn't vanish, it just loses control. The same patterns that once drained energy now offer small moments of resilience and community. Flaws become less like private verdicts and more like human quirks that everyone shares. Humor helps you stop defending your insecurities and instead recognize them in proportion. But there is another layer. Humor makes flaws approachable, and when they are approachable, you're able to engage them directly. That means time and energy stop leaking into shame and concealment. What was once spent on defense or performance is freed back into progress. And that raised capacity is what the next movement turns toward. What happens when you stop rejecting flaws, stop hiding the energy they consume, and begin using that energy elsewhere? Real change starts small, and the shadow becomes lighter when you approach it with clear steps instead of endless struggle. Think of this as your takeaway: name it, track it, reframe it, redirect it. 4 short moves you can repeat anytime a hidden habit slips in. Now here's your challenge. Type 1 small habit you'll try this week to expose your shadow, maybe setting a 5-minute timer to finally send that email. If these micro tools felt useful, like this video, subscribe, and share your test in the comments. Facing one small habit honestly, this week can reshape the next 12 months.